Thank you everyone for being here today for the first Bingham seminar of 2021, or rather the first of the academic year 21-22. This, of course, is the first in-person Bingham seminar of the new series, so thank you to those who've made it here in the room. But thank you also to those watching on Balliol's social media channels. This event is, of course, being recorded, and we'll look to those for all future Bingham seminars, so you have the opportunity to be here either in person or to view the event later through YouTube. So the first Bingham seminar then in person and in 2021 is going to focus on this question of freedom of information and the rule of law. So the Freedom of Information Act 2000 transformed the transparency of the British state by creating a right of access to information held by public authorities for the first time. The Act implemented a manifesto commitment of the Labour Party in the 1997 general election, and it's been listed among the most significant constitutional reforms enacted in that period. Yet, while the UK's FOI system reaches further in some ways than in other jurisdictions, it also contains numerous conditional and blanket exemptions and has suffered from increasing problems with enforcement. In recent years, the Information Commissioner's Office, which deals with complaints under FOI requests, has had a worsening appeals backlog. And attention has also focused, and we'll definitely talk about this today, on the Cabinet Office's clearinghouse for freedom of information, which has been accused of blocking and delaying requests for political reasons. And journalists, such as two of our panelists today, have become increasingly concerned about a crisis in the operation of the law, which has made it unworkable for providing timely and efficient information release from public bodies. This also, in addition, has culminated in a PACAC inquiry into the Cabinet Office's clearinghouse, which indeed one of our panellists gave evidence to a few days ago. I'll briefly introduce our panellists before, I think, handing over to them for some initial remarks, and then we will take questions from the room and move over to general discussion. That can last, I think, up to about 6:30, but we'll see when we finish. So in no particular order, but in the order sort of they were listed. Jake Robotham, who you see on the far right of me, is a fellow of University College and an associate professor of law, the Faculty of Law here at Oxford. He was previously a lecturer at law at King's College and the University of Cambridge. He's also a qualified barrister and has worked on the staff of election campaigns for the US Senate. And his interests broadly are in media law, freedom of expression, and the legal regulation of the democratic process. Claire Miller, on my right, is an award-winning data journalist with more than a decade's experience in using FOI to create data visualizations and using data to enhance sort of journalistic practice. She's a regular user of FOI requests and has extensive knowledge of the Act. She's also the editor of the Reach Data Unit, which has been instrumental in providing sort of in-depth data journalism and innovative interactive content. And finally, on my left is George Greenwood. George is a data journalist at The Times and The Sunday Times. He combines freedom of information requests, programmatic analysis of open data, leaks, and what he describes in his profile as shoe leather reporting in the traditional style to cover corruption, lobbying, financial crime, and state failure. And also works to force the disclosure of government information through sort of a real specialism in the workings of the FOI appeal system, which he's also written numerous stories about. As I say, I'll hand over to our speakers now for a few opening remarks. I think we'll go in sort of reverse order of how I mentioned them, if that's all right. So I'm going to hand over to George first to talk about freedom of information.
Oh, my favourite subject. Thanks, Nick. I mean, first off, I think we should look at where we are, and obviously there's a lot of concerns about where we are at the moment, but actually look at the good. And actually, the Freedom of Information Act has been a transformative tool for journalists in the last 20 years. We've got stories we simply would have not got before without a whistleblower taking very big risks to release the stuff. We get within, hopefully a short amount of time these days. I mean, obviously, the expenses scandal, while not actually as a result of the Freedom of Information Act, the records were gathered to respond to a Freedom of Information Act and then leaked. And it was pressure from people like Ms. Brooke, who ensured that we would get access to that material. This year, we've had the Greensill scandal, and actually a lot of the text messages between the Treasury ministers and Mr. Cameron have come out through the operation of the Freedom of Information Act. And I had a quick look at just the headlines in the last week that came from FOI. We've had stories about honour-based violence being at an all-time high. We've had stories about the Environment Agency's inability to regulate private holders of flood defences. And we've had stories about police misconduct and about how many police misconduct hearings are held in private. So I think before we just start this discussion, FOI is being used and we are getting access to information that we would not otherwise have through its operation. And in that sense, it's been very successful. And the reason people like me and Claire do what we do is because we can do brilliant reporting using the Act. But on the other hand, we've got a problem. And that is there appears to be a growing sense within government at least that they are able to delay requests, that they are able to take a more aggressive approach to requesters, that they are able to push back and enforce, through the use of shortcomings in the wider system, delay responses until information is less newsworthy, less prevalent, and less useful for accountability purposes. So in the system, you have a lot of inbuilt delays that are now being more actively exploited, or what appear to be more actively exploited by departments that don't want to release things. So normally a request should take 20 working days, and that's time for the department to go find the information, assess it, redact it, provide it, talk to any interested parties. But almost always, when they're looking at these things, they take an extra 20 days by claiming there's a public interest they need to consider. They often then fail to respond within the time frame, and you have to go to the regulator to get a appeal against that. When you finally get an initial response, it can often be a refusal, and then you have to go back to them to ask for a review. There's no statutory time limit to that review, and that can often take months and months, at which you have to go back to the regulator again. Then they often will refuse again without adding much to their original response. Then you have to go to the regulator again to actually have a decision notice to enforce response. And in some cases, the departments will then take you to the tribunal system to try and fight the ruling of their own information commission. Now, that doesn't happen in every case. Often, at some point during the system, they will give in and say, okay, here you go. But certainly the Cabinet Office and central government departments where there are politically toxic or difficult issues that the FOI might reveal, are more willing to sort of see your bet and take you through this process. And that poses a lot of issues in terms of how the Act operates, because often the regulator of FOI, the ICO, will not take aggressive action to speed up this process. There's about a 6-month backlog with the ICO in terms of even assigning officers to cases. And while sometimes they can expedite things, that the bar is pretty high for that. So it appears to be in a situation where departments are feeling more free to try and block the release of information, or at least delay it for a long time. Secondly, we have the clearinghouse. Now, I got a story out in April about my own records within the clearinghouse, and in which they, I think official at Bayes talked to the clearinghouse, described me as the ever-active Mr. Greenwood. Now, requests are supposed to be objective and independent. They're supposed to be applicant bind. But what the clearinghouse appears to be doing is to act as a screening unit. And it is possible within that unit that political concerns are being taken into account, which really shouldn't, in the operation of the Act, play a part in deciding whether information is in the public interest to be released. There are also data protection concerns about the sharing of journalist information in government and the tracking of journalistic work, which brings civil rights concerns. And there's also an issue with exactly how the requests are coordinated in departments, because often it's very helpful. I'm going to try and request information about police forces. If one force gives me one thing and says, oh, here you go, and another rejects it, as has happened with a recent story, you can fight that. You can say, well, Avon and Somerset gave me that, why can't you? And that is an attempt, the function of the clearinghouse seems to be to make sure rogue departments don't give you what you want. And that makes it harder to fight the appeal process by just sending the response from another department. So those are really big concerns in terms of how access to information is being impeded by departments that are more resistant to just follow the law ultimately, but follow the rules. So those are two of the sort of big problems with actually the enforcement of FOI. We also have some problems with the operation of the Act itself in terms of exemptions, which sometimes makes it harder for requesters to get information they want. I mean, one big thing is scope. So we don't have a right, except in terms of internal records within the department, to details of contracts. So if they outsource a prison, it's harder to get hold of details about that prison under FOI than it is if it's a state-run prison. And under the Act, unless it's a wholly owned subsidiary of a government department, it's almost impossible to get information out of those companies unless it originates from the department itself. Often, pseudo-public bodies are also exempt. So water companies, which are in the news right now for their very poor practices in terms of ensuring clean water, water that goes into rivers is clean and treated. They're not subject to FOIA. They are subject to the environmental information regulations, which is something slightly different, but the scope is much narrower than under FOIA. And that's the best of the bunch, because housing associations are not covered at all by any sort of transparency regulation under FOI or the environmental information regulation. So, you have people who have a really key role in society, looking after, people who, maybe are having supported housing. And it's very hard to get information out of those bodies. And in terms of cost, in America under FOI, the cost limits are much higher. So you can get sort of reams and reams of documents that you go through in sort of a spotlight-style investigations room. Where in the UK, the limit is quite low and hasn't really been changed since the start of the Act. And that can make it difficult to sort of build a picture of what's going on. You have to put, a series of small requests in, or you have to be very, very narrow in what you want, in which case you might miss what you're actually looking for. So in terms of the cost of FOI, it's still quite low compared to other jurisdictions, and that can make it quite hard to actually use it as a tool. I think that's probably enough from me for now, but is there anything else? I'm sure Claire will pick up anything I've missed.
Great. Well, thank you, George. Claire, then.
I think I'm going to say I agree with a lot of your points. I think I'm just going to kind of broaden it out to non-central government, because while there is clearly a massive problem with central government's handling of FOI, it's something that pervades the whole system. The majority of the FOI requests that I do, I make to councils, to police forces, to hospital trusts. And it's very hard to know, whereas with the government, what we're starting to find is that it's knowingly bad behaviour. They are actively trying to avoid the Act. Outside of central government, it's very hard to know what is councils, hospital trusts, etc., trying to avoid answering questions, and what is people just not knowing the Act, not understanding what the statutory requirements are, not knowing how to apply exemptions. The problem is that FOI practice across the country is very, very poor. And it's something that ends up going back to the regulator and its inability to regulate and its inability to help people understand the Act. In putting in FOI requests over the years, I get repeated problems around poorly applied exemptions. Part of the Act is that if you can't give people the information, you need to explain why you can't give them the information, because they need to know why. So either they can appeal and say, well, actually, I think you've made a mistake here, or so they can go, oh, actually, no, that makes sense, that's fair, I can understand that. When you send FOIs now, you very rarely get an explanation of what the reason for it. Sometimes you don't even get told what exemption they've applied, which is helpful, but you very rarely get an explanation. And sometimes that may be, as George said, because they're trying to avoid. So they know that if they don't tell you, you'll put in an internal review, they can drag that out for months, not really come back with anything, send you around. Sometimes I think it genuinely is that people don't actually understand the law that they're being expected to implement, including the ICO. I've had some interesting decision notices from them and the arguments with them. I think that's what probably the problem with FOI more broadly is that it's very unloved by people who aren't journalists. Somebody brought up the Tony Blair comment about FOI and about how you said it's like saying to somebody who's hitting you with a stick, say, stop that, here, have a mallet. And I think that's very much how a lot of public bodies regard it, that it's something annoying, that they don't really want to have to do, that they don't want to put resources into, that they much rather put resources into press officers who generally aren't as useful as an FOI response. But FOI is absolutely vital from a journalistic point of view in terms of what we get. The entire point of FOI is it allows us to ask for what we want to find out. Because open data, which seems to have largely fallen by the wayside as an idea, sounds great. It sounds like we'll be transparent, we'll put out data, you'll be able to access it and do what you want with it. But it's very much around letting public bodies decide what open data they want to put out. With FOI, you can say, actually, I want to find out about this, I want to ask you questions about this. It also allows you to fill in gaps. One of the big problems with open data and the fact that that didn't really last as an idea is that there used to be interesting statistical releases that were released, things around things like assaults on hospital workers, which aren't released anymore, but we probably still want to know that's going on. So FOI allows you to fill in those blanks of information that you previously had access to, which you don't anymore. And I think the issue with trying to access that information is that you want it to be timely, and the system at the moment doesn't allow you to get timely information. In theory, it's 20 days, and some do come back in 20 days. I send ones to, say, all the councils, and I'll get, some will come back straight away, some will be very helpful, some won't reply, some will send exemptions that don't make sense. It's very hard to build a picture when you've got this kind of patchy implementation, and you know that the regulator isn't going to do anything about it, at least not in any kind of sensible time frame. And who will also complain if you complain to them too much. I did once get told off by the ICO for sending too many Section 10 complaints for timeliness of responses, because they're drowning in complaints at this point, which, to be fair, is kind of their own fault, because they don't take a strong line on non-compliance, and they don't actually do what they say they want to do, which is put out advice and assistance and help people understand the Act better, which they don't do. So they've got all these problems building up. It's notable because I work across the entire country. I also deal with the Scottish Information Commission's office, who are a lot more efficient, because I think they only deal with the information FOI complaints rather than data protection and FOI. So it's notable how much quicker and how much more responsive, and how much better they are in terms of they publish sort of a weekly or monthly email about decision notices, telling people what decision notices they've done, what that means, how you'd apply that, because that's the information that I think FOI officers just don't get from the ICO, is how to apply exemptions better, so you understand the law better and do your job better, and we'd possibly be in a better place than we are now.
Thank you. Jake, then, finally.
Okay, great, thanks.
Yeah.
Right, I'm approaching this not as a specialist in freedom of information law, but as a general media lawyer and public lawyer who has an interest in this area. And I just want to go back and think about when the freedom of information law was first enacted. There was quite a bit of scepticism on the part of a number of academic commentators, because they felt like it was riddled with quite wide exemptions, and also it contained something called the ministerial veto, which allowed the minister to stop the release of certain information. Now, despite that initial scepticism, I think the practice of the Freedom of Information Act has been a lot more successful, and I think a lot of that is down to the fact that there's an independent system of adjudication. So there's the Information Commissioner, and there's also a tribunal. So if a public body relies on an exemption, you can at least go to the Commissioner and to a tribunal to try and challenge that, and there's some independent oversight of the system. But transparency, the other factor I think that's also changed things was a decision of the Supreme Court in a case called Evans, basically said that the veto can only be exercised in very exceptional circumstances. So that also limited the scope of government control over the release of information. But, you know, transparency doesn't win all the time under Freedom of Information Act, but as we've heard, it's been an important source for news stories. And I think part of this is the fact that we've got determined data journalists who know the Act, are familiar with it, and will push back on refusals. Because the average person might put in a Freedom of Information request, you get told no, it's exempt, and you just give up. So I think it's important you have specialists that know the system and know when to complain and know what type of argument to push back on. But as we've also heard, it's not always popular with public bodies, and it's not popular for, you know, a mixture of reasons. Some of them are legitimate, you know, in that there's an incredible burden that's put on public bodies to comply with the Act. It does take up significant resources and significant time. Public bodies might also worry that the information that's out there won't be properly interpreted or might be open to misinterpretation. But then again, there are other arguments or other reasons they don't like it that we should be more suspicious of, in particular that they find the information a bit embarrassing or it puts them in a bad light. So that's one of the worries there. Now, public bodies might be worried about freedom of information or might not like it that much, but what they're not going to do is just repeal it or have some draconian restriction on it, I think. I think if they tried to do that, there would be a significant backlash against it. So I think Freedom of Information Act is pretty firmly established. What I think is more likely, or the approach that you tend to get from governments, are proposals or steps to kind of manage the system of freedom of information or take more subtle types of measures. So sometimes that might be proposing an amendment where you make a seemingly technical change to the wording of an exemption, but it could actually drastically expand its scope or its applicability. But it's not really that visible. It's not going to make it to the front pages of the news. It's not going to mobilise a great deal of public opinion. So that's one way that you can try and limit freedom of information. Another thing is underfund the regulator, so it doesn't have the people there or the resources to process all the complaints that are made to it. We've been hearing earlier as well about the culture in which, you know, some public bodies maybe drag their feet a little bit and try and delay responses as far as possible. And that's also something that's seen in the recent reports from Open Democracy as well on this issue. And I think ultimately the clearinghouse is something that seemed to fit within this strategy. The reports or the alarm that the clearinghouse is generating is partly because it's seen as this strategy of managing freedom of information rather than trying to overtly restrict it. Now, it's quite difficult to know what to make of the clearinghouse, looking at it from a distance, because, you know, the government say the clearinghouse has been in existence since 2004, I think is when they say it's set up, or it's certainly been there since the operation of the Act. And they say there's an important need for coordination and consistency in FOI responses. But the recent reports that we've been reading in the press and with Open Democracy suggest that there's a little bit more to it than that. So I think the Open Democracy report suggests that the clearinghouse isn't just advising on freedom of information requests, it's pretty much guiding what the response will be from certain departments. We've also heard that is it the round robin lists that they send around to departments? That's where they've been naming journalists, as you mentioned before. And I think the worry there is that that means that the media are subject to special scrutiny or some kind of special treatment if they're making a request that maybe this is a claim that needs to be managed. And also, if you look at the criteria for reference to the clearinghouse, it says, is the request on a matter of political sensitivity? That's one of the criteria there. And all these things add up to, I guess, the fear is that the response to Freedom of Information Act requests and the general strategy is being tailored to part of the government's political agenda. And it's part of a system of overall news management rather than just processing the requests according to the terms of the Act. Now, this is the suspicion. I'm not sure I can verify. I don't know enough about this. I think what it does require is further investigation, get the facts out in the open, and we've been hearing about how there's a parliamentary committee that is going to do that. But if there is any substance to these concerns, I think it's serious. Because if you were to refuse or treat a freedom of information request differently because the requester is a journalist, then I think that could be contrary to the Freedom of Information Act, contrary to administrative law, and potentially a breach of Article 10 of the European Convention. So I think it's a serious point there, but the trouble is it's always hard to tell, because government can always put forward a plausible reason for a refusal. So I think it's one of those. It's just one of those difficulties of like, can we tell? Is the clearinghouse performing this useful, legitimate function that government says, or is there something else going on? I don't think the allegations are completely paranoid. If we look at it, because you might say it's part of a more general strategy to manage the media, where, let's say, government actors have refused to participate with certain news programmes and broadcasters, where, you know, a couple of years ago, I think, the Council of Europe issued a media freedom alert when they claimed that a news organisation had been blacklisted by a government department and they weren't providing information. More recently, there have been things like threats to the BBC about their future and their funding. And it basically fits with this view that maybe government are trying to manage those institutions that are supposed to hold them to account. And I think the worry about the clearinghouse, and I think we got to the thing we want to find out about, is whether it really is part of that strategy or whether there's a legitimate reason under it. So I think really the general lesson from this is we see, you know, if we're looking at free speech and media freedom, it's not simply something that's left to the courts to go and adjudicate particular decisions and complaints that are made to them. I think what you really need is a culture within government that supports that, which supports freedom of information, and also you need independent institutions that actually oversee government, and they need sufficient stability and independence from government, and that includes, you know, adequate funding.
Okay, well, thank you to our panellists for those introductory remarks. So as I said, I'm now going to sort of move to our audience in the room for any questions that you have. I have a few, but I will try not to abuse my position as chair and ask the audience first. So would anyone like to ask our panellists a question? Helen? I should bring you this, I think, or pass it to you.
Thanks, Nick. I have to admit, my name is Helen Ghosh. I'm the Master of Balliol, and I'm a former very senior civil servant, and therefore I've been on the end of the mallets lots of times. But I think I'm asking initially just a technical question. One of the things I've observed over the years is that whether it's journalists or activists or whatever, always say is there are loopholes in the law, when actually what they mean is this law doesn't say exactly what it is I wanted it to say, and as possibly Parliament intended it to say. What I couldn't quite make out from your comments was, are the delays and stretching the timescale, or are those actually things that they are doing within the provisions of the Freedom of Information Act? And what you would actually like to see, which I think comes back to your point, is amendments to the Freedom of Information Act to tighten up timescales, to limit. Or, so are they actually acting within the letter of the Freedom of Information Act, and you would like it to be amended, or not? That was really my question.
So, do you mind? I think it's a bit of both. Obviously, as a big fan of FOI, I would love it to be quicker. I fully appreciate that governments have the priority sometimes, and it will take time. The problem is, so there are some loopholes within the law in terms of how the sort of...
Do you mean loopholes in the law? You mean things that you would like to change in the law? Sorry, that's my question about
loopholes.
Yeah,
sure. So the issue is around how... So under the Act, there is no statutory... For example, there's no statutory rule of how long an internal review must take. The definition is that it's a reasonable time, and it's up to the regulator to determine what that reasonable time is. So if a regulator has the regulator's guidance, it should take 20 to 40 working days to do that. Often that it takes far longer than that. So when the Cabinet Office takes like 80 days to respond to my request, they're not in breach of a rule that says they must respond within 20 to 40 working days. They're in breach of the regulator's guidance on what reasonableness is, and they're also, and that obviously they are aware that there's not a legal rule for them to have to take that time, but they are stretching the definition of what reasonableness is. So the problem is less that the law doesn't set out the process for this stuff. The issue is that the regulator is not enforcing its determinations of what is reasonable in these cases. It's the same thing with ICO complaints. The regulator doesn't, there's not in the Act a sort of time limit for the amount of time a regulator must take to determine a decision, otherwise the regulator is in breach, for example. And the problem with underfunding, it means that because there is no statutory rule on that it can take a lot longer than maybe Parliament intended for that process to happen. So when I mean loophole, I completely get your point that it's not just that, obviously I would love the law to say these things much more clearly, but it's not just that there's an issue with the statute. The way that the statute is being applied and the way that these shortcomings in the Act are manifesting themselves in terms of regulatory issues and Department's approach to it, I would argue is undermining how Parliament intended that Act to function. So that's sort of maybe the best way I can describe it. It's an issue of where the language is maybe not clear enough in the Act, that's being exploited and that regulatory failure is making that worse. It's not that Parliaments are breaching the letter of the law, but they are breaking guidelines and the regulator's not stopping them, basically.
Mm-hmm. I was going to probably say there's plenty of breaching the letter of the law going on. As when you put in a request, you have 20 working days with some things around. Damn it, I forgot the word. But so it's like 20 working days to come back with a response to that request. And there's plenty of not doing that. I think when I send out requests, big requests or round robin requests, between a fifth and a third of public bodies do not get back within 20 working days. Plenty of them have not gone back to you a month later, 2 months later. You go to the ICO and plenty will not get back to you because the ICO usually gives them like a 10-day warning, which is sort of the nice approach of going, we know that you haven't responded to this, you've got 10 working days to do it. Plenty won't respond to that. I mean, some will get a decision notice issued against them. It's about the only decision notices the ICO is issuing at the moment is on timeliness, and still won't. The problem is, I don't think the ICO has ever, what it can do if bodies don't comply with the decision notice is certify it to the High Court. I don't think they've ever done that. They will go to great lengths, and they literally will ring up public bodies and nag them until they send out a response if you chase up a complied with decision notice. The ICO is very reluctant to use the powers that it does actually have. At least that's what it appears to be the case.
I don't have a great deal to add to that, other than just reading the Open Democracy report that was published last week. I mean, as an example, they give lots of examples of some things that go against maybe the spirit of the law, others where they might say that the law's not being complied with. But I think the bigger issue is the kind of sense of how they become a culture whereby people just leave it, push it, drag their feet within the law, and then what becomes the time limit is, that becomes the moment when you release the information, you do it at the last moment possible, and that just becomes the routine way of working. That's the kind of impression you get from the criticisms. Obviously, speak to people in government and they may have a different view, but that's the line of argument rather than direct breaches. Yeah.
I do find, I thought the discussion about, is the clearinghouse political? Are they trying to manage the news? Well, of course they are. I mean, of course they are. They're politicians. Can I just ask one more question?
Yes.
The problem is Turkeys don't like voting for Christmas, and I just wondered whether when you speak to opposition politicians, they show any keenness at all to change the FOI Act, since they will be, perhaps, in government one day. It's a tricky political issue for them, I guess.
I'm based in Wales, so obviously in Wales the Tories are the opposition and are very enthusiastic users of the FOI Act to get stories about the Labour government. So yes, I think when you're in opposition you rather love FOI, and when you're in power you really don't.
You really don't.
I mean, it's almost the sort of Odyssean pact, which, the sort of binding yourself to the mast to avoid the sirens calling you off when you're in opposition. Because you want to call the government intransparent, corrupt, everything you want along that list. And you say, we're going to be the least corrupt ever, we're going to submit ourselves to the Freedom of Information Act, which is what Labour did in 97. And of course, then you go to this government and it is the sort of mallet, so to speak. I think opposition is quite aware of this stuff. I mean, obviously, they are enthusiastic users of the Act, as well as, speaking about its benefits and criticising failures. I know in the Labour manifesto last time, there was a commitment to expand FOI, though, of course, they haven't had a chance to put that into force. I'd be surprised they didn't have something in their next manifesto about it, but it's all down to being able to do it rather than, and how much of a priority it is within that document if they do get into power. But But I think it's around, if you do want to, say, improve the Act or reform the Act, make it more expansive, you know, it has to be quite a wide campaign. It can't just be the opposition, because who's going to put their feet to the fire when they're in power? You know, I talk to people across the political spectrum, from the Taxpayers Alliance to Open Democracy, and actually a lot of these people are on the same page around transparency. You know, the Taxpayers Alliance wants to find, you know, how much we're spending, you know, government departments are spending on sort of, you know, first-class flights and things like that. And obviously, Open Democracy want to make the system work better. And actually, I think part of the problem is a lot of these people don't like each other very much and aren't talking about the actual constitutional issue, which is FOI, and they won't sit down and campaign together because, you know, there are political concerns around being seen to be in bed with somebody they find distasteful. And I think that's something where, you know, there needs to be more of an organised campaign where you are taking people from left and right, from different sort of ideological views, and actually saying, no, you know, transparency is a good thing for everybody. And you know, I hope that can be done. And obviously, you know, if all opposition parties are saying we're going to do this and the government looks bad, they might do it themselves. I mean, we'll see, you know, how enthusiastic Boris Johnson is about the Freedom of Information Act, which I'm probably sure is not very much, but you know, I think that is basically our problem, is that, you know, it is very much binding yourself to the mast for the next government, but can we convince opposition politicians to do that, or the government to bind itself?
Interested in what you're saying about the kind of political element to the clearing house as well. I mean, the impression they say it's about coordination and about consistency. And I guess what you're saying is, you know, a politician or political actors, ministers will always have an eye on the wider political landscape. But on the other hand, the Act does actually explain, you know, here are the exemptions, here are the reasons. And what I think is problematic is if requests are being managed, so you can try and refuse them on the grounds that are embarrassing. That's obviously not a legitimate public reason, and that's the worry that people are having, is that taking the lead? And I think it's really, I think ultimately at the moment we're in a position where we want to get greater transparency about what's going on, what's the criteria, how are these things working, and so on.
Yeah.
I think that's where we are.
Just to be clear, you know, former Permanent Secretary at the Home Office says it's all a political game. I didn't mean that. I meant...
It's too late.
You're on camera now.
Here's a man who really knows about it. Former colleague. I simply meant it's not surprising that they want to manage the news agenda, and knowing what FOI requests are out there and making sure that in that sense they're coordinated, they know when it's going to go, they know how to prepare for it, they've got their mates in Parliament lined up. That's very unsurprising. Yeah. And, you know, you guys and the academics will think, oh, well, this is very improper, but it's perfectly reasonable in the sense that they are politicians trying to manage a news agenda.
Mm-hmm. And to govern.
And to govern, yes.
Would you like to take... Oh,
sorry.
Yes, you could pass it forward first. Yes, thank you.
Oh, do I need that? Okay. I mean, you're approaching, I mean, I fully understand the virtue of having an open society, which is really what you're talking about, isn't it? But how far do you, I'm interested in what you see as the attacks on the open society in this way, through the Freedom of Information Act and its improper working, as you would see it, and that relationship with the actual rule of law. How does it truly affect the rule of law? What are you saying that it's already damaged the rule of law, or it's fundamentally torpedoed it below the waterline, or, you know, is it just a minor incident and a minor annoyance which hasn't actually affected the concept?
Well, I mean, do we ask our lawyer that first?
Oh, great, thanks. Okay. I mean, I think a couple of things with rule of law issues. First of all, you can think about the issue of underfunding a regulator, or does the regulator have the powers or the resources? That could raise a rule of law issue if it means that government actors can sort of act with impunity or ignore certain obligations, knowing there's not going to be a serious sanction. I guess other rule of law factors as well would be the idea of transparent government and actually being able to monitor government and see that it's acting in accord. You know, so you can say freedom of information requests are an important component in ensuring that government are acting in a way that is lawful, that are acting for lawful reasons, and so on. So it's, a system of transparency is part of the compliance with the rule of law, and that's probably how I would connect the issue. Did you have a different take on it?
I mean, merely, I think the concept of the law was Dicey, wasn't it? I mean, the old Bailey man Dicey, who actually first used the phrase. And they didn't have any Freedom of Information Act then. So, and he, of course, had a different concept of how the rule of law would develop, which has accelerated in our times. But nonetheless, do you not think that, well, perhaps you do think that Parliament was not a sufficient brake on the executive until the rule of law came along, till the Freedom of Information Act came along?
What, that I don't think that Parliament was being sufficient?
I mean, what's the difference? I mean, was it never drawn to account? Of course it was drawn to account. And many examples. And what difference has this made?
Well, no, a lot of information was only getting released under what was then the 30-year rule, and now it's down to 20 years. Yes. So it was much harder to get access to certain information, and as we heard before, you needed an insider source if you wanted to find certain things out. I mean, there were ways that government could be held to account, but government had a lot more authority and control over the flow and release of information, say 40 years ago, than they do now.
Yes, but was the rule of law torpedoed? What you're saying is that, yes, that's...
Well, I'm not sure it's torpedoed. I just think if you have a system where you can actually monitor government more effectively, it's more likely to comply with the rule of law. I take a fairly minimalist view of the rule of law and see its, and some of its requirements as fairly flexible anyway, but I won't, that's probably one for a different debate.
Yeah. But I guess to our journalists, I mean, what is it that you can do using freedom of information or other things that Parliament can't, right? If we're thinking about that as the alternative method by which government can be held to account.
I mean, I guess part of the issue of the rule of law is you can't apply it if you don't know what's going on. So, if there are failures in organisations that are, if people are breaking the law but no one's noticing it, and you don't know until you find through an FOI request, the rule of law can't really apply in that sense. I think there's also a sense in which, part of the problem with Parliament, as we've known, is it's white and male, and some issues, and less so now, but still, over the top. Very much, the majority of MPs are still, white men called John. If something's affecting communities that Parliament is not made up by, perhaps, black women in South London, and they want to campaign on something, for example, if they're having massive health inequalities, Parliament won't know to look. And the point of the Freedom of Information Act is it's not a right of an elected official to ask, for example, parliamentary questions. It's the right of a citizen. Citizens can then get access to the information that they would not otherwise have a right to, and can raise that issue, maybe with their MP, for example, who might not otherwise know. Again, maybe even through no fault of their own, but they just don't know these issues are going on. So I think, beyond the more general fourth estate role of the press and actually identifying wrongdoing, finding problems, and then going to our role is going to the legislature and saying, well, this is going on, what are you going to do about it? I think what FOI does is it democratises that process of actually looking at what issues need to be solved. And I think that's a really important thing, in terms of the more general sort of wider sense of rule of law. One other point that does concern me about problems with having FOI is, FOI is the law, it's not guidelines, it's not sort of, official, guidance on what you should do or what would be nice to do. It is the law. And the fact that so many public bodies are just breaking the law when they don't respond within 20 working days. Some of the rest is guidelines, but, straight up breaking the law. And the regulator often doesn't do anything to inflict any sort of penalties for that. It's quite concerning because, if government departments are all breaking the law all the time, I think there is a sense in which that sense of impunity, and it does undermine the rule of law, somewhat. I don't think we're going to be sort of looking forward to a sort of dictator anytime soon, but it is, there's a part of me that worries that is that sort of drip, drip, drip of, the things we think are valuable in society not being enforced.
I don't have a lot to add to that. Beyond that it kind of gives powers to question to people who wouldn't have had it before. It also gives them powers to question at a more local level because it applies to so many different public bodies. It means that you can take your concerns and try to get information from whichever public body is affecting you. I think it's the other thing to add on the amount of law breaking basically going on is that what concern should we have about a regulator that has powers but doesn't use them?
I think we had a question at the back, didn't we? So could you pass the... Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
No way. Very good. Thanks very much.
Hello. So my name's Paddy McGuinness, and until 2018 I was a civil servant, like the Master, and I was actually the Government Chief Security Officer, amongst other things, and therefore responsible for the proper handling of information, its classification, and its restriction from release. So I kind of come at this from a slightly different perspective from the panel. Oddly, not thinking that the Freedom of Information Act shouldn't function, but rather asking myself whether there is adequate definition of what should not be released, and is that clearly enough stated to enable the efficient action of the Freedom of Information Act, and also asking whether or not there's appropriate legal sanction for the protection of information that shouldn't be released. And it does seem to me an important factor if we want to talk about accountability, because with this panel, we've gone to a thing where we're talking really about fourth estate accountability, which I would argue is almost the least constitutional. So I thought Claire's characterisation of the Conservative Party in Wales' use of the Act sounded just right to me, that people involved in the political process got hold of information that they were able to apply, including in, ideally, a chamber where it could be properly dealt with. Chambers which often have a way of handling information that shouldn't otherwise be released or cannot otherwise be released. And I must confess, there's a question here, by the way. and the really interesting thing for me is whether or not we are closing down the space where good policy can be made and good government can be run. And I think that's been particularly true. We've seen it through the pandemic. And, I also was frankly my experience in government. So in a way, my question is, and maybe this is a law question, it's also a journalistic question, which is, what is an appropriate way for defining the information which should not be released? And is there adequate legal protection for that and definition of that? And I say this as the person who commissioned the Law Commission to look at the reform of the Official Secrets Act, making it much clearer what should and should not be protected. So I'm really interested in that. How would you draw what you shouldn't have access to? Last thought for you, just to be really pokey. One of the problems with having a fourth estate conversation is that you make money out of it. Do you know? So civil servants, when they approach this, one of the things in their mind is that, frankly, this is about commerce, not about constitutional practice. And it's just worth having that in mind, just to be a little bit pokey.
That's great, thank you. Well, I guess our journalists, then, would you like to respond to this?
I can start. I think the way in which the Act is set up in terms of the exemptions is that there's not a lot of information in them about what should. It's very much down to individual FOI officers to try and come up with an idea of whether the information that they've tracked down within their organisation is exempt or isn't. And a big part of that problem is that the guidance that the ICO puts out is years out of date, doesn't take into account like more recent case law, and is in many cases extremely vague. So to some extent, I can agree that there is a big problem of kind of, it's not necessarily clear to people what should and should be exempt. My area that I spend quite a lot of time arguing around with public bodies on is personal information, and whether information that I want them to share is actually personal information and could identify someone, or whether it couldn't. Obviously, if they do release personal information that can identify it, there are consequences due to the Data Protection Act. But the anonymisation guidance put out by the ICO is extremely vague. The decision notices that councils rely on is very out of date. I mean, this is if they rely on them at all. I mean, quite a lot of them. The long-running argument I have is around them just being like, this is a small number, therefore they're identifiable, therefore we can't give it to you, which isn't necessarily true. It's a more complicated sort of decision-making process than that. I think what I'm trying to get to is that, yes, it would really probably help with exemptions to be clearer around what it is, and that's a role that the ICO is supposed to have but doesn't. Because at the moment it's just a lot of FOI officers trying to figure out, and lots of requesters arguing with them until it finally makes itself way to the upper tier tribunal and becomes precedent that the ICO doesn't share. So nobody knows that precedent exists.
Yeah, it's a fun situation.
Yeah.
I think there's two questions here. I mean, firstly, we have things like the national security exemption in the body of FOIA for a reason, right? It is that I probably shouldn't be able to go to MI6 and say, please can I have a list of all our spies currently in China? That could cause their lifespans to be somewhat curtailed. And I think there is information that actually it's not in the public interest to release. And I think actually having a sensible discussion, you know, and I think the Act addresses that quite well in terms of the exemptions, that there is information that we have to be very careful about. I think the vast majority of information that I ask for has that in mind, and actually the arguments against release are pretty poor. Again, we know what we're talking about. We've done these requests for years. We know the presence, we know the tribunals, we know how the acts operate. We're not asking for things like that list of spies in China because we know we're never going to get it, and actually there's good reason why. The problem is that this concept of safe space is sometimes abused by government to try and avoid releasing stuff that's special. I mean, to give you an example, at the moment, I'm in a long-running battle about trying to get information about the national flagship, the new royal yacht, for example. Now, that is of questionable public value. There's certainly polling by YouGov which says most people don't want it, and yet the government is going ahead with that. They are arguing that they need to retain a lot of information at the early stage of that under safe space arguments. And there might well be some stuff in there that's right. You know, if you're looking at, you know, for example, which bid you're going to go to, whether you're going to do it UK or abroad. But blanket rejecting everything is just in clear breach of what the regulations are trying to achieve. And that's the problem, is that often, you know, there are safe space arguments that are important, and it is important that civil servants are given that space to discuss things. But the government is often claiming protection for that in cases where there's a very, very weak public interest. To give you another example, I'm currently in a sort of nearly 9-month battle to get access to correspondence between a cabinet minister and his donor, who then went on to get a load of PPE contracts. That is being blanket exempted under safe space exemptions. There is not a strong case. I don't know how you can come to the conclusion that correspondence between a minister and a donor where there's a clear conflict of interest, it is not, that, you know, there may be some space for purposes, but that is not on the balance of it in the public interest being disclosed. This is the problem, I think, with the operation of the Act, is so often, you know, again, partly because the regulator takes so long to intervene, that government departments are sort of asserting it is in the public interest and making these safe space claims when there aren't strong reasons for it. And actually, if you get to the tribunal system, that safe space arguments are upheld. You know, often, if it is genuinely, we're coming up with policy ideas on something, we need to do some in-depth research, we need to have a think about stuff in a sort of very open, frank way, that is protected by the regulator and by the tribunal, who actually who recognise the value of this. But it's so often that the government is trying to argue stuff that is in this space, stuff that they claim is this space in this space which actually isn't, or where there's a really, really clear public interest case, you know, bordering on anti-corruption, that they try and claim this protection. That is one of the big problems. So it's not a problem with I think the safe space is incredibly important, and the exemption's in there for a reason. But I think it's being borderline abused by some government departments. So I think hopefully I've sort of answered those two elements of your question.
It's about the money.
Oh, the money one, yes, no.
Before we do the money, so having seen my friend, yeah, what do I do with my So I mean, obviously I've kind of been on the inside of this, and I just two characterisations I think which are useful. First of all, the clearinghouse is actually a chivying mechanism, and there is a strong reason for standardisation of your approach, precisely because to preserve safe space, you need all of the departments who hold the information to understand that there is that requirement. And Avon and Somerset Police may not understand it in a way that someone in the Home Office may. And that may be a great advantage to you in writing your 800 words by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. But that isn't actually good practice of public policy. It's not good governance. So you do need to have some mechanism. And then the very interesting thing within government is that you sit as a civil servant, and certainly I sat, with a constant stream of correspondence from within government about your FOI obligations and having to manage your teams to release the resource to be able to process the whole thing. And there's a kind of constant thing within it. And there is no politics in it. It's a simple matter of there being a set of people, there being, people able to do 100 things, and there being 110 things to do, and at times some of the things will be more important than providing information to you, and that'll just be a reality, particularly true at the moment. So that, to me, the characterization of this needs a little work, and in particular around the idea of breaking the law. Because to my mind, breaking the law is when one goes to a tribunal or a court and a judge says, you've broken the law. Or a jury says, in the case of an individual, you've broken the law. And I don't think we have cases like that. So, I strongly agree with you about authorities like the ICO taking a more forward role and us pushing into the actual use of tribunal. In other areas of oversight, and my particular expertise clearly is in the kind of national security world, my word, the Investigatory Powers Tribunal is a powerful body. My word, it's a powerful body. And people are found to have done things wrong, and things have changed as a result. And you kind of want to see that around FOI, I suggest, rather than saying, oh, the law's being broken. Because you only have that proof when you go to court, I'd suggest.
I mean, to our lawyer, I guess, is that the way to think about it?
Well, I mean, a few things that were raised there, just in terms of the exemptions, the point you made earlier. I mean, I think they're fairly broad, generally worded, and, are they specific enough? Well, that's where you get the guidance from the tribunal. They develop a body of case law. Obviously, there'll be occasions where people think they can be tweaked because they need further clarification or need to be expanded. And I guess the worry you always have there is it being done for a legitimate purpose, or is it some underhand way of trying to undermine the proper functioning of the Act? And that's where you need to be vigilant. So I'm sure there could be improvements to some of the exemptions, but on the other hand, the general scheme of things seems to be about right. I think you could make them much more specific. You raised also a point about reform of the Official Secrets Act, which comes into this, and the withholding. I mean, it's interesting. There was a proposal from the Law Commission, but that suggested a stronger penalty for leaking information, or a stricter approach to those who leak information, but that was going to be compensated with a statutory commissioner where there could be an internal complaint, and as a last resort, a public interest defence. And I think on the last time I saw the government's consultation, I don't think they're pursuing the latter options, but they were going for the stricter approach towards leakers. So I think if you are going to change the law, there does need to be a balance within that. I wasn't sure I was fully understanding the point, though, about the breaking of the law and where we're saying that. Are we talking about when someone refuses to release information and whether that's, and they're doing so in good faith and they're subsequently told by the tribunal that's unlawful?
No, I was more characterising, and I think it was you characterised it, the way in which the process was working.
Yeah.
The people ended up not observing guidance they'd been given by a commissioner and the like. Characterising that as breaking the law seems to me to be questionable unless you've escalated it and taken it to a judicial body which has said you are at fault, you've done something wrong.
I mean, I think the problem as well that you get here is that difficulty of how to characterise something, because you're right to say, public bodies are burdened, dealing with this stuff, it comes in all the time. They can't, there are limits to what can be done, and, there are real reasons why they might not want information to be released. On the other hand, it's how we differentiate that from, trying to cover up embarrassing information. And it's trying to get that extra information and ensuring that we've got kind of transparency about the system of transparency. I think that's what the current debate is really focusing on, rather than clearly saying this. Like you say, there's a legitimate reason for the clearinghouse, but there's also concerns that is there something else going on there? And really, I don't know any more than that, to be honest.
Shall I address the money point as well?
Yes, I think we have two more questions there and there, but do address the point about money first.
Look,
you're going to say the Times is part of the Constitution.
Yeah, well, I think it is at this stage. Paper of record and all that. But no, I think it's important that we have a broad media landscape, and actually comes down to natures of who is a journalist, right? I think papers like mine perform many functions. I am more in an accountability function. And I think newspaper use of FOI, there is some, less good use of FOI, shall we say, around, one story I read about what did prisoners have for Christmas lunch in a prison, for example. But I think most of the time, people who use FOI, again, I think what was the worst one I've ever seen is, please could you explain why COVID is real to one of the NHS bodies, which ended up on one of their websites. So there are, but then I think with those cases we do have the vexatious exemption, and actually in the proper operation of the Act, if there's no serious purpose for the Act, for the request, public bodies do have that power to say, no, bugger off, you're clearly a lunatic. When they're using that power on me, which they have done several times, I begin to sort of question how effective that's being used, which is happened on several occasions now. So I think the issue in terms of money is that I think it's valuable that we have a mix of media providers, some which are commercial, and look, we are out there to make money, but we make money by providing good, important stories that people want to read. And I think that's fine. I think that, we have to pay journalists for them to exist. And if we didn't do that, then I think we'd be a much poorer country for it if we were relying purely on, charitable journalism, or third sector organisations. At the same time, do I think it? I don't think it should just be commercial people. The FOI is used by charities, campaigners, individuals, people who just feel there's something wrong going on and want to find out. It's not just evil Murdoch commercial people like me, sort of exploiting poor civil servants and making them work harder. There is a sort of much wider use of accountability. A wider sense of the fourth estate. And so I think obviously yes, we make money out of it, but at the same time, if they didn't make money out of it, there wouldn't be as many journalists looking into this stuff, and we'd all be much poorer for it.
How effective?
If you could use the microphone so it's picked up on the...
I can hear everybody in the room.
Or it's being recorded.
So it's picked up on the recording,
so sorry. How effective is our legislation in terms of open government with other members, comparable members of the Council of Europe? How much easier would your job be if you're working in Germany or the Netherlands or France, for example? Do you have colleagues in those countries that complain to you about their own?
Yes, I would love to be a journalist in Norway or Sweden. Right. It's so interesting when you look at the differences in how those countries operate in transparency. Yeah. And there's a very fun exercise where a letter went round various government departments as a communique, and you got the British one under British FOI and it was all blacked out. And the one they requested it in Norway because it was between Norway and Britain and it was just completely given over. I think there are countries, especially the Scandinavian countries, that have much more. I mean, they had FOI in sort of 18th century, so they're a bit ahead of us on that. But there are some countries where there is this culture of transparency. And the argument I always make is these are very well-functioning policies which tend to be well-run. The world didn't collapse when they were transparent, and they're also not having to release security information from their security services or stuff that genuinely is, shouldn't be given out to people like me. So I think that there are countries where they're in a much better place in this space, and it's just, I think, a real public good. There are lots of countries that are a lot worse. Trying to get information out of the French government under their sort of access to information rule. Good luck. I mean, they have no independent regulator. I mean, Ireland, for example, is another one where you have to pay fees to take your case to the regulator, and actually it effectively cuts off the use of the Act unless you work for a big Irish commercial site or a big charity that can just foot the fees. So there are better sort of situations where it's the culture of transparency is much more sort of endowed in society and regulators more independent. We're not the worst, and our Act goes a bit wider than others, but it is a bit of a mixed bag within Europe. And I think Russia does have an access to information rule, which is occasionally used, but how effective that would be, I'm not quite sure. Well, we'll never know. They'll never respond to my FOI request.
Thank you.
Did you have a reflection on that?
No.
The other thing actually to note just on think about European countries is also the European Court of Human Rights is very much developing a positive obligation on states to provide a right to access.
That's what I was wondering,
yes.
Article 10.
Yeah, under Article 10, and there's been some developments there. I mean, I'm not sure Article 10 on a case-by-case basis is the way to develop freedom of information because there's certain definitions and a level of clarity you need that I think is best dealt with via legislation. But it's certainly becoming something that a court's more expansive on, and in some circumstances they'll say there's a right to access if the information's already held by government. Yeah.
Thank you.
Did you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Victoria White, and I'm an international data privacy lawyer. So sort of I see a little bit of the other side of the function of the ICO. But I've got sort of two sort of brief questions. Firstly, in your experience since the Act sort of came into place, and obviously it was a new Act, we've never had it before in the UK, you give the regulator a little bit of time to sort of get used to build up their experience and things. But overall, what do you see as sort of the trend of sort of their responses? And you've touched upon sort of perhaps their sort of lack of teeth, as it were. And also very recently, during the pandemic, when obviously a lot of the civil servants in the offices were working from home, etc., whether that that sort of period has sort of developed into being a bit of a black hole. And from your own experiences, sort of in terms of responses and things, what's been that period, and what do you see sort of going forwards is likely to be sort of the effect of that?
The ICO, I don't think, coped well with working from home. I had a case going through tribunal, so I think I was due a response of them like the 30th of March. I didn't get that till a year later because they were working from home, they didn't have printers, nobody could go into the office. It really did not work. They didn't switch well. Though a lot of that was them saying it was working from home, it is a bit part of a wider trend. I have had problems before. They're not very good at responding to court instructions. So they'll be given a date to respond to things, and then they'll ask for an extension, and then they'll ask for another extension. So there is an issue that they just aren't very organised. And I think the pandemic made that much worse. And I think in terms of numbers of FOIs going in, I think requesters were quite respectful of the fact that everybody had quite a lot of stuff going on. The number of requests went down massively. I know I didn't put many in during the sort of main lockdown period. So there was kind of an understanding from people who put requests in that now possibly wasn't the time for something about library books or, how much you're spending on tea and coffee, that maybe those things could wait. And so there was probably less pressure on them in terms of stuff coming through in terms of complaints because there were less requests. But their backlog goes back to before the pandemic and it's just continued to build. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered all the questions, I think.
I mean, NHS England are sending me lots of emails now saying, oh, this information you asked for in sort of April, May 2020, would you still like it? Now, in that case, maybe you can make a special case that, they were trying to deal with the pandemic, but it does mean, a lot of really important issues around how the pandemic was handled. Particularly one big sort of FOI request I put around was, people being released from hospital without being tested for COVID back to care homes, which was a crucial issue, and actually I think will come back to being one of the most damning things in the eventual inquiry. I got enough to do the story, but lots of NHS trusts didn't respond, and the NHS England just didn't respond as well. So there's a balance, right? I mean, I think I didn't make any requests, I didn't make very many requests at all during, the first lockdown, because again, you're just not going to get a response. People are trying to sort of panic and get everything into space. But I think, shadowing what's been said already, I think that the regulator has not done enough, and it's possibly not been funded enough to reset after the pandemic and say, right, we're going to clear our backlogs now, start from square one and start enforcing again. Because basically, the commissioner said, we'll be lenient on you during the pandemic for obvious reasons. If your policy team is trying to deal with the problem, they just can't talk to you as quickly. But I think there's a difference between delay and just not responding. So what I found is, even on really important matters, like on anti-corruption stuff, like on serious failures, a lot of public bodies are using the excuse of the pandemic not to respond, rather than just say, can we respond by an extended date, or can we have an extension, or can we come back to you in a couple of months, which I think is maybe the correct approach. Is not sort of forgetting your FOI responsibilities, but it's in the balance of things, as you said, like 100 things to do, this is the 110th, recognising this is important, there are other important things to do, but you can't just not do this less important thing at all. And I think that's perhaps where the ICO has got the balance slightly wrong in terms of enforcement of ICO during the pandemic, is perhaps they should think more carefully around what can wait and what can't. And I don't feel they're often very good at doing expedited cases where, like, the body is clearly just trying to get away with something that's not okay and needs to be on the public record so we can have a proper democratic debate about what's going on. We'll also see that request in the same way as one of the COVID lunatics saying, you know, please can you explain how Jeff Bezos infected everybody in 2019 with his Chinese virus? Please give me all records around that, which I've seen, you know, requests like that. And I think that's something maybe they need to do better, is actually say, no, this is a request from, you know, the main charity on this topic. They've raised real concerns about this in the past. This information could achieve their aim. We should probably take that one seriously. And I just think that's something they may have been able to do better.
Any more questions from the room?
Can I only just a last one? I'm intrigued by this. Going back to Paddy's thing about, you know, is this the thing you get your highly stressed staff to look at? It's interesting that you start to trail there the idea of significant requests and insignificant requests. And I don't know if others' experience matches mine from civil service days, but part of the problem is they're not quite, you use the term, vexatious. You can't say this is vexatious, but it's the member of staff who's got a gripe about the performance management system you've just introduced, and that's what in fact, as we know, staff use FOI a great deal in public institutions to find out what they want to do. Blah, 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 blah. You implied that you thought that there might be a justification, not just now, but perhaps more generally, for you should concentrate on the most important cases first of all. How would you triage that if you did?
So it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think within the initial sense, maybe it's something that doesn't need to happen in the department. I think automatically departments will, say, in fact, triage and say, well, if we respond in 21 days to this COVID lunatic, you go to the ICO, they're not going to enforce, whereas if you come to, if my request is delayed, I'm going to write in the paper about you delaying and start making a bit of an issue with it. I think it actually comes down to triaging at a later stage. And I think, when it comes to the ICO, given their resource limits, given their long backlog, I think it gets to the stage where you can't just do it in the order requests come in, because there does have to be a public interest sort of assessment of, how important these requests are, as otherwise you're going to, damage everybody the same. And not hold, departments like the Cabinet Office, who are repeatedly complained against, who repeatedly, misapply exemptions, don't respond, engage in this sort of silly buggers approach. Almost those ones need more resources, because if you can't enforce FOI on the body that actually is responsible for FOI in the country, what are you going to be able to do to everyone else when that's the example? So I do think the ICO needs to be a bit more clever with their backlog and say, what is it most important we have in a timely manner? And again, some of my requests, it doesn't matter if it's left a year, because it's annoying, but actually I'll still get the story. Where there's some requests, but actually something is important at this moment. We really need to discuss this right now, but I can't get it because of the backlogs. And I guess that sort of assessment of timeliness, the importance of timeliness and public interest, is something they're really bad at doing, and I wish they were better at.
Martin, thanks. Yeah, my question is very much related to that, and it's about, would you and how would you limit what you might call fishing trips? So people who just go out and say, let's put in a request and see what there is there, because those are costly. So I work in the NHS, and the time and energy spent by people collecting those data is time and energy that's not spent on patient care. In some ways, it's easier in Ireland, isn't it? Because you can see the real cost of it. There is a cost in the UK. It's hidden away because it's resources taken from somebody else. So the question then is, fishing trips, do we just have to put up with them? If so, or if we don't, how do we limit them? And what would be an acceptable hit rate for a fishing trip?
How are we defining fishing trip?
I'm defining it as a request where someone says, look, I think there might be something going on here. I'm going to request all this information, and let's just see what comes up. Because the answer is nothing of any great significance might come up. Nothing that's going to lead to a story. Nothing that's going to lead to a change in an improvement in anyone's life. It's just consumed a lot of resources, and nothing comes of it. And that just seems to me to be wasteful. And that's different from the situation where you have a strong sense that there might be something really important going on, and you're going after it. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the opposite, really.
Well,
maybe it doesn't happen. Maybe I'm talking about something that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, it can only consume a limited amount of resources because there's a cost limit. It can't take up more than 18 to 24 hours of your time because that's the limit. So from a point of view of like journalists, there's no point just asking vaguely for stuff because we'll just get hit by the cost limits, and they are quite hard to appeal because it's, you know, you can't really tell how bad. I mean, a lot of the problems with the cost limits are because records management systems are terrible. So, I mean, at least part of the problem is there is if you're taking you hours to find stuff, it's usually because your records management system is terrible. I mean, police, I've literally spoken to police forces who can't do and or queries on their systems. So you're like, how do you get anything done? So the thing with there is like, if you're getting really, really vague ones, it may be because somebody is trying to hide what they're exactly what they're asking for, because they know there is something there and they know there's a really good story, but they don't want to tip off the people and it get stuck in the never-ending ICO backlog because someone's gone, oh, we can't release this. This is embarrassing. Just find an exemption and get rid of them. So phishing trips, some that seem vague, can sometimes be about hiding the real purpose. Phishing trips that are just vague will almost certainly get hit by cost or vexatious exemptions because they're not going anywhere. They're going to take forever, and people will go, this is going to take 50 hours, let's not do it. So there are things in the Act that stop complete phishing trips of total pointlessness that are going to take forever. Most journalists are pretty good at, most journalists, as they learn to do FOI, get very good at kind of tailoring requests so they actually get what they want. Because we've all seen the 50-question FOI request that you're like, don't put that in.
Why are you lying bastards lying to me about this, the FOI? I think that's the point, is actually there are particular protections in place for public bodies around lunatics, for want of a better word. The vexatious exemption, I've actually... there's a guy called Mr. Dransfield who got very upset about a bridge in my hometown and spent 5 years trying to find that there was corruption in the sort of awarding of the contract, and actually managed to set the standards for what is a vexatious request by being found by I think it was the upper tier tribunal to be so vexatious that he defined the law in vexatiousness, which I always found quite funny. And then he emailed me saying he could give me a great exposure into a massive cover-up once a few months ago, which was a fun interaction, but there we are. There are these people out there. There's people who don't understand the law, who don't understand the purpose of the law, who will use it in this way. But there are also protections, and part of, again, the ICO's role is to sort of guide public authorities to say, no, don't spend 18 hours looking, for whether, you expense the cost of, arsenic, to kill your patients or something like that. Actually you can take the identity of a requester into account in those cases and just say no, or it's going to cost too much. And actually, part of the value of FOI is it shows you where problems in your record management systems are that hopefully would, cause something to be done about. Obviously, there are budget issues at times, but at least you know about the problems or what's held and not held. So I think there are, for public bodies, the protections in place to deal with these kind of requests. And then you get some borderline issues, but at the end of the day, I think FOI has shown so much institutional problems that sometimes if there's an annoying request you don't think is a purpose, sometimes the cost of doing that is worth it for the wider benefits of transparency. And also sometimes things people don't know it's a problem until you find out. I mean, look at the, sometimes lots of little bits of information across lots of public bodies. It might be annoying for one public body to find one bit of information, but actually when you put the picture across 100 authorities, that could be something really, really damning or something really, bad. So often bear in mind that it's not just one authority that's getting these requests. Often you'll go round robins. I'm sure, identified, somehow between sort of FOI officers know each other and just say, get informal advice of each other on how to handle this stuff, or aware it's a sort of wide one. But actually, what may not seem that important to one authority actually could be really important when you're doing a wider piece of research on this topic.
Okay, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask my sort of one question, which is that one of the reasons why I want to talk about this in this seminar is that I think lawyers at the moment are talking a lot about threats to the rule of law. But the front line for most of the legal profession, and indeed what political scientists are often talking about, is judicial review. That we're talking about folks, we're talking about access to justice through the courts. And I sort of wonder, as lawyers and journalists who work on this quite different area in which accountability is gained from the state, are we not thinking about freedom of information enough? Should we be wrapping this into our broader discussions of the rule of law? And do you see analogies between what at least some see as this government's kind of broader agenda to roll back the constitutional reform of the last 15 years in this area as well as in others?
Yeah, I mean, I would say there definitely is a comparison in it relates back to the point I made earlier about the general strategy of managing institutions that are supposed to hold government to account. So it's a management of, those institutions of political accountability, but also you might say there's an attempt to try and manage or at least curb some of the institutions for legal accountability. And, there are, in all of these areas, there will be legitimate concerns that government may have, and it's a matter of identifying those. But I think it is kind of a twin issue, if you like. Well, yeah, we've got to try and protect both, I think, freedom of information, the issues going on there, the issues going on with media freedom more generally, are something that you could say are a counterpart to what we see with limits on judicial review as well. So I think it's all part of the institutions that we require in a healthy, well-functioning democracy.
Yeah, sure. So I think that there's a question of who it should be to hold government to account in all of this. And I think what the FOIA did, is it did expand that out to the citizen in a way, perhaps the most fundamental way of any sort of reform in the last 100 years, perhaps beyond giving people the vote, is that now, if you are a citizen activist, if you're someone who wants to make a change in the world, you can start gathering information. You have powers that you never used to have. And I think perhaps in our sort of discussion of rule of law, there is this wider sense of government accountability beyond the ballot box, that actually, in between elections, we do have much stronger powers than we ever had before to try and do that accountability work ourselves. Now, some people do it by tweeting racist things on Twitter. It's not done well, but actually, I think it does give you a really valuable way in which any of us are empowered. And I think the concern I have around things like the clearinghouse, the things like underfunding the regulator or not the regulator seriously, is that those rights, as Parliament intended to give us, again, limited rights with exemptions, but rights nonetheless, it's becoming harder to use them unless you're a sector expert like us, where we know, when to call bluff and when not to. and I in terms of the rule of law, I'm concerned that while in legal terms we still have these rights, in practice, this ability to hold those in power to account is being weakened, and I think that would be a very bad thing if that continued to get worse than where we are now.
Final word.
Yeah, I think it's picking up that you shouldn't have to be an expert in FOI to use it. It should be something that's accessible to everyone, and at the moment it's not. And it's not because the government is undermining it, because it's so much wider than that. I don't think the government is telling Liverpool Council to issue poor responses. I think they're doing that all by themselves. But the holes in it are not just around refusals to respond. It's around the way in which some bodies won't even take your request unless you jump through hoops which aren't acceptable in the Act. And if you don't know the Act, then you wouldn't know that. So, yes, I think the peril is that the FOI Act ends up as this kind of neglected, unappreciated law that isn't really enforced because people in power just don't really like it. But it's vital that we defend it.
And I think also, just to add one more point, when you read the white paper for the Act, the Act isn't just around, accountability because it's a good story. It's about improving government and how government works. And often, when government doesn't talk to each other, it's because things get siloed and you don't realise information is being shared from one to the other. I mean, one of the stories I've been working on for sort of 4 or 5 months is how, how children's services are not sharing information with police forces around vulnerable children. Now, the whole point of FOA is to make government departments realise there are issues that may not be the political priority at the time, but can become so after public pressure. And I think if we lost that ability to dig out information from maybe neglected parts of government that are really important but maybe not of the moment, actually ensuring that those are working properly is part of the crucial functions of the Act, so that we can, even not through the press, even just through, an MP might make a request, an activist can go to the right people and say, this is something that's really concerning. It's not just me anecdotally. The department or the agency or the council recognises this is problematic. We probably should do something about this. And I think that part, of the Act's intentions, it's not just about, giving journalists a mallet. It's around that much deeper sense of democracy that I think we could do so much more on in this country.
So, I think we are about up to time, so it only remains for me to thank our 3 panellists for that incredibly interesting discussion, and indeed our audience in the room, who were both knowledgeable and extremely incisive with their questions, and also to thank our audience online for watching the seminar today. The Bingham seminar will return next term at roughly the same sort of midpoint, and there will be another Bingham lecture in May, so do look out for those announcements. Thank you.